Hello there, I'm Jim Zirin. You're watching Conversations in the Digital Age. With beheadings in Syria, military trials in Guantanamo, a refugee problem on our southern coast, and a rising tide of anti-Semitism and extremism in Europe, our show turns to the issue of human rights. And with us is an expert in the field. She is Elisa Massimino. Elisa Massimino is the president and Chief Executive Officer of Human Rights First, which is a NGO, a non-governmental organization, which is dedicated to further understanding and advocacy in this very important field. Elisa, we're delighted to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks,
now,
Jim.
you come to us from Poland, where you were a keynote speaker at a conference. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, happy to. I was in Poland over the weekend. In the last couple of days, I just got back last night for the annual meeting of an intergovernmental body called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was an institution that flowed out of the Helsinki process and the Helsinki Declaration in 1975. And this was a meeting, an annual meeting, where the representatives of governments and a few non-governmental organizations, but mostly governments, come together to talk about the challenges that they are facing in implementing their commitments under the OSCE structure, and also to evaluate each other. This is an implementation meeting where they're supposed to take a hard look at what's happening, and of course this is a moment where there's a lot happening in Europe.
So there were representatives there from Russia as well as the United States?
Yes, in fact, so the OSCE is the only transatlantic organization that has both Russia and the United States. So it's a unique opportunity in a way, in a structured environment to address these issues.
So were any sparks flying?
There were some sparks flying, and I'm sure this meeting goes on actually for 2 or 3 weeks, and this was the opening session. My job was to kind of set the parameters and the framework for the meeting, and as is the job of NGOs, to shake things up a little bit and step outside of diplomatic speak and just kind of say it like it is. And so I did, and spoke both about the challenges that we face here in the United States in living up to our own ideals on human rights, but really about the challenges in Europe. And of course, the dominant theme was the Russian action in Ukraine.
Well, it was a stirring keynote address. I assume it will be available on the website of Human Rights First.
And also the OSCE, yes.
And the OSCE, and certainly should be read by all interested people and others as well. But let's start with the issue of counterterrorism and human rights. Now, we've recently witnessed these horrific, brutal beheadings in Syria. What effect does that have on counterterrorism strategy and your advocacy for adhering to human rights values in our so-called war on terror?
The threat of terrorism is obviously, we all see it now thanks to social media and those horrible beheadings by ISIS, that the terrorist threat is not gone away. It's morphed, it's moved, it's a changing dynamic, and we have to be able to respond to it. Terrorism poses a huge threat to human rights, obviously. One of the things...
And the basic human right is not to be murdered.
Right, right. And there are many other rights that a terrorist organization like ISIS would violate and are violating. So it's important to find the right response to that, and important to learn some of the lessons of our past responses because terrorist organizations are different from other state enemies, and we need to get smarter. They adapt, we need to also adapt. But one of the things that we've been really concerned about is the habit that we have gotten into with respect to responding to terrorism, we as the United States, and probably beyond the United States as well, since we lead a coalition to address these challenges. The habit that we've gotten into in framing our counterterrorism responses primarily around military response, and wondering whether that actually is sufficient to address the problem. We don't think it is, and whether we have gotten out of the habit of spending our time, energy, money in addressing some of the root causes of terrorism, and really how you deter people who are kind of on the fence, not the hardcore terrorists. You can't really convert those folks to give up that ideology, but terrorism thrives in places where there's weak rule of law, human rights violations. This is one of the themes I was trying to sound in the speech on Monday, is that, you know, many people argue that when you've got these horrible, violent, brutal organizations and threats, that human rights needs to be kind of put on the back burner for a little while we deal with these more urgent problems. And that's completely backwards, I think. That in fact, a lot of the attraction to some of these groups from people who are, you know, could go either way, if you will, in their societies is a sense of hopelessness about their own economic situation, their human dignity, their ability to have responsive government. And we need to think about all of those factors when we strategize about combating terrorism.
Well, one prong of our strategy has been detention. Indeed, it's been detention without trial. Obama in 2008 ran for office on a plank of closing Guantanamo. Here we are 6 years after his election and 13 years after 9/11, and we still have 148 detainees in Guantanamo. Some of them are standing trial even as we speak.
Yes.
So what are we doing about that, and what is your organization advocating with respect to Guantanamo and military trials?
Well, Guantanamo is one of those places where, you know, I often think those 148 people are not the only ones trapped in there. You know, the U.S. seems to be trapped in there too.
The U.S. government is trapped in there.
You know, people forget, because it's been such a politically polarizing issue in recent times. But when the president was running, and during that campaign, there was broad agreement from the candidates and from the military that Guantanamo was a net loser for us in terms of, you know, both financially, from a strategic point of view on counterterrorism, and certainly it was dragging our good name in the mud around the world on human rights. And so there was a consensus around that. But just as you see, a consensus at some level around, you know, the immigration issues, that doesn't mean that our political process is such that it can produce a solution, and that's been really, really frustrating. You know, I remember that John McCain was one of the first people to go down to Guantanamo from the Congress, came back, and very early, and came back and said, this is nuts. We really need to either try these people or get them out of here. It's not serving us well. And that was many years ago.
Charles Evans Hughes said of disarmament, the only way to disarm is to disarm. So the only way to close Guantanamo is to close Guantanamo. Why haven't we done it?
It's so true. And, you know, you kind of, even President Bush used to muse, I wish we could close Guantanamo. And you sort of want to say, well, if the president of the most powerful country in the world can't do something like that, you know, who can? But I think that now, you know, Congress has put some restrictions on the executive branch to fill this vacuum, you know, and has pushed back, and now it has become more complicated, but it's not impossible. And in fact, Human Rights First did a very detailed blueprint called How to Close Guantanamo. And you close it, as you say, Jim, by closing it. And here's the, you know, you go through these steps. One of the big challenges, as you know, is that President Obama has persisted in wanting to try the 9/11 plotters in these military commissions down there, and that and that's a very now looking to be, it's a many years long process. I think that's a huge mistake, not only because it's making it more difficult to close that prison down,
but also we've had such success with trials of terrorists in civil courts. We tried them long before 9/11, and we tried them after the first attack on the World Trade Center. No one was been acquitted, to my knowledge, because that's what people are worried about, that they'd be acquitted in a civilian court. And the civilian courts have been extremely, particularly in the Southern District of New York, extremely expert in trying terrorist cases. So why do we persist? We're going to have years of litigation.
Yeah.
However it comes out, it won't be accepted by the international community. Why are we doing this?
Well, as you know, I asked the same question.
I'm preaching to
and
the choir,
I feel very strongly about it, that it's a big mistake for our country. If you think about it just strategically, and you look at the hundreds of terrorism cases that have gone through the regular federal courts successfully, not only has there been a very high conviction rate, which as a human rights activist, that's not my judge about whether or not the trials are fair.
But that's part of the political calculus.
It is very much a part of the political calculus, and I think it's actually, people are so misinformed by the political demagoguery around this issue. In fact, the very few cases that have made it all the way through the military commission system down there, the sentences have not been very lengthy, and some of the people who have been through that process are already free now. Whereas here you have people, including somebody from Guantanamo who was transferred to federal court here in Manhattan, and was convicted, and the world didn't end, and it didn't create a new target for Al-Qaeda, and despite all of the predictions of former Vice President Dick Cheney and others, we know how to do this.
Let's move on to another subject, which is the disturbing rise of extremism and anti-Semitism in Europe. We've seen anti-Semitic protests in riots, actually, in Belgium and France, and even in Germany, with the attempted firebombing of synagogue in, I think it's called Wuttertal. And now, what do you make of all this, and what is your organization doing with regard to possibly combating it?
Well, we've been at this a long time, looking at starting around 9/11 actually, and just after that, doing research and reporting on the disturbing rise of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, and other hate crime and discrimination. But one of the things that we've learned is that hate doesn't stay in these neat little boxes, anti-Semitism, homophobia, racism. It tends to take hold in a culture, in a society, and while the victims stay in their kind of tight-knit communities trying to combat those abuses, our approach has been to try to bring them together and look at the root causes of all of these kinds of hate crimes and discrimination. And
but
also,
it's not just the economic situation.
It's really not. And I think a lot of people either try to, you hear people say, well, it's a reaction to what's going on in Israel and Gaza, there's spikes in that, or it's because of immigration of Muslims into Europe, or it's because of the economic situation. We did a report recently, and what we've found is that anti-Semitism has very deep roots in Europe, obviously, and these factors can exacerbate it. But what we've seen very disturbingly is politicians actively trying to take advantage of those situations in order to encourage this kind of abuse. We just did a report on looking at Hungary and Greece, two places where, and we looked at those places because that's where the violence and violent rhetoric seems most extreme. And looking
this is
at
the Jobbik Party
Jobbik,
in Hungary, and the Golden Dawn in Greece.
Golden Dawn, yes, which is a terrifying.
Who parade with sort of quasi-Nazi.
Oh, not
symbols.
quasi. They are a full-blown
swastikas.
It's a full-blown Nazi ideology, violence. Now, the Greek government has recently taken steps, finally, after a long time of ignoring this problem, now has launched a criminal case against the leaders of Golden Dawn. But they had, by that time, really had tentacles in the police, in the military. The people who are being charged in this criminal trial, some of them are members of parliament. So it's really quite frightening. And, you know, without saying, you know, we're on the verge of you know, what happened with the rise of Nazism in Germany, you know, there are a lot of similarities. And Putin is not, does not have clean hands on all of this. So it's really important. Our
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reports about, if you think about who benefits from this, you know, these are members of the EU, so and they have
committed to human rights values,
which has you know, a strong commitment to human rights values, and you have Hungary and other countries now electing fascist people from fascist parties into the European Parliament. So, you know, it's
or sending ambassadors. I think the Hungarian ambassador to Italy is an avowed anti-Semite.
To the Vatican, yeah, exactly. And and of course, Viktor Orban, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary, is trying to play this both ways, and he has many fans in the United States. But part of the reason we wanted to do this report is to get people in. You know, obviously, as we're talking about, there are a lot of problems in the world right now, but many of them require the active cooperation with our allies in Europe, and the degree to which the EU is weakened makes that much more difficult. The United States need to be paying much closer attention to this.
But isn't it true that many of the rioters and protesters in Europe and the more vocal demonstrators, as well as those who committed the murder of 4 people in the Jewish Museum in Brussels last May, were Muslims and were really Muslim terrorists?
Yes, so this is a complex problem. And it needs to be addressed, you know, in a way that addresses all those different facets of the problem. But one of the things that we wanted to make clear is that, you know, there are very deep roots of anti-Semitism in Europe, and they are being activated now. If you look at, it's interesting that you know, some of this comes in countries where there hasn't been large-scale immigration, and some countries where there has been, and where the economic situation is equally bad, this has not taken place. This rise of Nazi or fascist parties and anti-Semitism. And why is that? You know, a big part of it has to do with political leadership, and when you have someone like Prime Minister Orban, who, you know, while he has condemned anti-Semitism, as you mentioned, sends a well-known anti-Semite to be Hungarian ambassador to the Vatican, and he's taken many. If it's too long to go through the list of everything that he's been doing now, there's a very insidious kind of attempt to rewrite history in Hungary right now, including through actions that are ostensibly to memorialize the Holocaust, but to rewrite that history to make Hungarians completely the victims of Germany. And while in fact it's the case that they you know, participated quite actively in sending many Hungarian Jews to their deaths.
Plus, there are reports that in these European countries, particularly Belgium and France and Germany and Hungary, there's been a resurgence of what's called soft anti-Semitism, where perhaps there aren't acts of violence committed against Jews, but anti-Semitism is much more out in the open, and people are expressing either Holocaust denial or condemnation of Jews in connection with Gaza or not, and this it becomes a rising problem, doesn't it?
It's a very serious problem, and it's one that has to be tackled very carefully because, of course, we probably even more than Europeans are deeply committed to free speech.
Freedom for the ideas we hate.
Exactly, exactly. Of course, there are lines that can be crossed into incitement to violence, and those lines are being crossed very much in many European countries right now. And many European leaders are finally realizing that you don't have to pass laws prohibiting speech to combat this kind of speech. What you need to do, as the prime ministers of France, Germany, and some others recently did, is to very publicly push back.
Yes.
And when this happens, you have to stand up and say, this has no place in our discourse. We reject this. And I think that leaders are finally waking up to the need to do that. They've been very, very slow to do that, shamefully slow.
Okay, let's move on to the question of refugees, which of course is so central to human rights ideals, and in the United States, on our own southern border, we have these problems. What is your organization doing with regard to that?
Right. Well, refugee protection is really, it's so central to not just Human Rights First agenda, but really to our identity as a nation,
And the issue is largely individuals from Central America, from El Salvador and Guatemala, who are fearing violence against them in their own countries, who are coming across the border, of course without papers, seeking asylum in the United States. Now, how is that being handled?
Well, not very well right now. I want to just say a word to put it in a little bit of broader context, because Americans start to pay attention to refugees when there's something like Haitian people coming by boat, or Cubans, or that affects us directly, and now this surge over the southern border of Guatemalans and Salvadorans and Hondurans. But refugees are a massive problem in the world. People, they are the physical manifestations of human rights abuses, and that's kind of the way I view them. If you want to see what's going on in the world, look where the refugee flows are. Look at Syria, what's going on now. There's
144,000 in recent days went to Turkey from Syria.
There are, half of the population of that country has been displaced by the conflict. Half the population, more than 1 million children, 2 million.
So what are you doing in Texas?
So we recently opened an office
New Mexico.
in Texas.
You did.
That's a big news for us. We've been around for more than 35 years. It's our first new office in 20 years, and it is to help address that challenge.
Are you looking at all into the situation in Brooks County, Texas, where refugees are tromping 40 miles to circumvent the checkpoint at Foul Furious?
We are, and we've been down. In fact, my team just came back from Texas, we looked at in New Mexico, Texas, and California at detention facilities being set up. The attitude has been to try to deter people from coming by putting more people in detention, moving their cases more quickly. And if you think about it, any of us, if we're in a situation that some of these mothers who have come over with their children are in, we've sat down with them, listened to their stories. Many of them are in situations where, violent gangs run their countries practically, frankly, and the police cannot protect them, or are, corrupt and cooperating with the violent gangs, the drug cartels. And they're recruiting and killing children, kidnapping them. What would you do? I have 3 kids. If I was in that situation, Nothing would
Well, what
deter me.
about protecting those refugees in their 40-mile trek across the desert, where many of them die almost every week?
It's a horrible...
Because there's not enough water for them, and there's not enough patrolling by the border police to at least arrest them and save their lives.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation. You have some NGOs who are down there trying to, find them, make sure that they have water and all that. But that's always been a problem on the southern border, where you have enforcement. That's why enforcement is not the answer to this problem. That's what, this is the debate we've been having in this country for so long is, first we have to have, complete hermetically sealed border before we can deal with the policy of immigration. It's so wrong-headed, and it's so hurting our country.
So wrong-headed. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. So in the last year, have there been gains or losses in the area of human rights? Elisa Massimino.
Both.
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 Very good. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure,
coming by.
Jim.
This is really wonderful. And thank you for coming by. Please tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I am Jim Zirin. Would you please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. All the best.